Hi, good evening, everybody. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism here at the Carter Institute of Journalism at NYU. I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program, which is a master's program. And I'm also the director of the Science Communication Workshops, which train PhDs and postdocs, scientists here at NYU, how to communicate science to lay audiences. So we're very serious about science communication here at NYU. And I am really excited about today's topic, which I will admit some people in our community were like, really? You're going to have an event about UFOs? To which I say, heck yeah, we're going to have an event about UFOs. Because UFOs, the concept of UFOs, well, science is about more than science. Science is a process, but it is also very much about culture. Well, I think that's all I'll say about it for now. But I'm super excited about this and very grateful to Nadia Drake and Sarah Scoles, both of whom traveled a very long distance to be with us. But I will leave it for Anna to formally introduce them, except just to say thank you very much to both of you. Sorry I'm standing in front of you. Our host tonight is Anna Rothschild, who is really a wonderful presenter, journalist, entrepreneur, and also a Sharp graduate, of which we're very proud. We just so you know, we encourage questions. Questions will come from the microphone. Questions online. You can use Twitter. I still insist on calling it Twitter for obvious reasons. You can use the Kavli Convo hashtag on Twitter. Okay, X. As long as X lasts, we'll stick with that. If you have questions, we will read them if we get to them. And with that, I will turn it over to Anna. Take it away.
Thanks, Dan.
Wow.
Just one little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our panelists. If you have a question, please really approach the mic. Don't be polite and stand far back. Sometimes it's unclear to me if you're just stretching your legs or you actually have a question for guests tonight. Anyway, it is absolutely my pleasure to announce our panelists tonight. We have Sarah Scoles. She is a freelance science writer and the author of Making Contact, Dill Tartar, and the Search for Extraterrestrial Life, and the book, They Are Already Here, UFO Culture and Why We See Saucers. She also has a new book coming out in February called Countdown, The Blinding Future of Nuclear Weapons. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm here to bring the cheer and the doomsday. What are you here for?
Usually I bring the cheer and the doom, but I'll let you do that.
Also with us tonight is Nadia Drake. She is a science journalist and the physics editor at Quantum Magazine. She was also recently a member of NASA's independent study into unidentified aerial phenomena, also unidentified anomalous phenomena. We can get into that.
It is now unidentified anomalous phenomena, just to make it even more confusing.
Exactly. We really just have too much terminology to work with. So I'm very excited about this panel tonight. I've been sort of hyped about it all semester long, in part because I just think in my lifetime, the past few years have just seen a huge flurry of UFO reporting in like really legit publications, like the New York Times, on 60 Minutes, on NPR, like across all media. And I think to start off this conversation I know in the audience there are definitely some like diehard UFO news followers, but for those who may not be quite as familiar with sort of like the history of what's happened recently, I was wondering if maybe, Sarah, you could kick us off with a bit of history about kind of what started this new kind of renewed interest in UFOs.
Sure, I'll give it a shot, although I will start the conversation by saying that I definitely do not have all or any of the answers about UFOs. unfortunately.
Let's
But,
just say from a news perspective,
yeah,
what
yeah.
happened news-wise
Right.
back in like 2017?
Right. So in 2017, I would say that UFOs kind of crossed into the mainstream when the New York Times, a publication you may have heard of, published this story, actually right around now, back in 2017, saying that there was this, hey, did you know there was a Pentagon research program that looked into UFOs, and here's this guy who worked for it, and they have, crashed UFO parts. They're investigating the medical effects of UFOs on people's bodies, and nobody's paying attention to this crazy thing that's going on. And so I think that is what started it all, was the revelation about this Pentagon program, which the details of which I imagine we might get into later. And then that kind of has rolled on for the past, I guess, 6 years since then, into congressional hearings and new task forces to identify UFOs, and just kind of took on a life of its own. I don't know how it looked from your side of things, but
It looked very hectic from my side of things. Yes, it was actually about this time of year. I remember because I was attempting to leave for the end of the year holidays, and I had to pull over and write a story about the other projects that the government has had historically looking into reports of unidentified, what do we want to call them? UFOs, UAP, and which UAP? What are we going with?
This is why I just said UFOs, just because it seemed more kind of like a term that everyone knows. But I know that kind of more and more in the scientific community, we're at least calling them UAPs, because I think I think most people have an idea of UFOs as having something inherently to do with extraterrestrials, and UAP, whether it's aerial or anomalous, could mean just something that we can't explain, right? So I leave it up to you.
Well, so the reason that the definition broadened to anomalous was to include space and water. Yeah, so just making it more broad in terms of where things that we don't know can show up.
Right. I'm curious, actually, before we sort of get into like a little deeper into that reporting, I'm curious, as two science journalists who were interested in the world of astronomy, astrophysics at that time, and as somebody who had to then sit down and write an article immediately, like, what sort of preconceived ideas did you both bring to this moment? And when you saw that first headline, like, what did it make you think and feel?
Well, I was on top of a mountain. I live in Colorado. I was cross-country skiing, and I got this New York Times news alert that says, hey, the Defense Department is interested in UFOs. And I said, no, they're not. I'm continuing to go skiing. And then I got home and actually read it, and I did not have to write about it immediately, which is maybe one of the perks of being a freelancer, is no one assigns you to jump on something right away. And so my initial feeling was skepticism, and I'm just gonna steer clear of that one. And then an editor for a magazine that I wrote for approached me and said, hey, do you want to look a little more deeply into the things that are in that New York Times article and see if they actually bear out or not? I had been interested in, obviously, astronomy and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence far away for a long time, but I kind of put UFOs in this whole other category that was like, that's not me, that's not science, I need nothing to do with that. And then obviously that changed because I'm sitting here. But yeah, that was my initial reaction.
My initial reaction was more along the lines of, here we go again. This is another news cycle where we are going to have to spend a lot of pixels explaining what it is that we know, and definitely what we do not know about UAP, and just thinking about that from the lay reader's perspective. And so I was a little bit exasperated. I was also very curious about the accuracy of the information in this story, the New York Times story. And I don't know if you remember, but a couple of days later they followed it up with kind of an editorial about how they did the reporting. And so they talked about the various meetings that they'd had with the characters in the story and how the different reporters became involved in it. And that was really interesting. But I think what we've seen over the years, and definitely correct me if I'm wrong, is that some of the assertions in that initial piece have not proven to be true.
Yes, that is correct.
well,
Trying to be very careful
We're
here.
in a journalism school right now, so let's talk about some of it. Yeah, I would love to kind of know what you both think of the 2017 reporting, and sort of what has felt rigorous and what has just raised more questions.
Yeah, I'll start, because that kind of was my initial assignment after that came out, was to kind of, why don't you take this story that came out sentence by sentence, see what the evidence behind each sentence is, and then see if it holds up. And once I was reading it, not just as a consumer of the New York Times, but as a journalist trying to write a story, it looked very different to me than just a casual reading. I think there was a lot in the story that seemed to be based on someone told me something. I can't tell you who or how they know, but that's not particularly strong evidence. And I think, the things that stand out to me that have not quite held up from that story are the videos. I don't know how many of you actually read the story at the time, but there were 2 videos of UFOs that came out with the story, and the story said that the Department of Defense had released those. They had not. They said that the man who was the central figure in the story directed the UFO research program. It appears he did not. They said that the UFO research program was a UFO research program. It appears that it was not. There's not a lot in there that does hold up, I would say.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the way that I read that story now is that there were some very powerful interests with a very strong motivation to have this information become public. And I'm not sure that the reporters knew enough about what some of that motivation might be to really start to dig into it and to verify the information. Like what Sarah was just saying, it's how do you say that this guy is directing a program that he didn't direct and that isn't the program that you said it is? That seems problematic.
Yeah, a lot of the reporting that's come out since then. Both Luis Elizondo and more recently, what's his name? Gort? Wait, I have it right now.
Grush? David Grush?
Yeah. Are sort of whistleblowers, government whistleblowers, and I'm curious how journalists deal with government with whistleblowers and sources that they need to kind of protect all the time. But I'm curious, when you're reporting on something like this, where people are coming at this story with either deep skepticism or deep belief, how do you contextualize what you're hearing from a whistleblower?
That's tricky. I haven't done a lot of reporting based on whistleblowers, so I don't have a lot of insight that I can offer there. But what I can say, and I'm sure Sarah has also experienced the same, is that when you're speaking about this particular issue and with the communities that are involved, it can be really intense. The depth of people's beliefs on both sides is sometimes unfathomable. And so you get into these conversations that seem like you're really arguing about something that's more along the lines of religion. You're just not going to win. It's not a discussion that you can have. You can't change someone's mind. And so when I approach that type of situation, which I've encountered a lot over my lifetime just because of what my dad started doing, I like to be objective and think about the information that's being presented to me. And, if someone's saying, I saw something that I don't understand, I can't explain it, that is totally valid. I get it. That is a very, very fair statement to say, I saw something and I don't understand it. And that's fine. And I will listen to that. But my problem is how you go from there and then you ascribe that thing that you can't understand to an unearthly intelligence.
I want to ask you a little bit more also about this sort of connection between religion and UFO culture generally. But I do want to say, for those who don't know, Nadia's father was Frank Drake of the Drake equation. So she comes by her interest in everything, space-related pretty naturally. So Sarah, in your book, you actually talk a lot about, you wrote a whole book on UFO culture, and you have a whole section devoted to like this idea about UFOs as religion. And I would love if you could just like speak to what you sort of learned as you dug into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I hadn't fully thought of them that way until I went to a UFO conference called the International UFO Congress, which is very official, and people there just had a whole range of beliefs, from like every one of you in the audience is a different species of alien, and aliens run Congress, to like we have a secret space program that's out combing the universe, and they would listen to each other's extremely different beliefs and just kind of accept them. Like, oh, I'd never heard that you all were different species of aliens, but that's very interesting. Thank you for informing me. And I was just like, how are you guys just taking this word as gospel? And then somebody gave a talk about how UFOs are kind of a new religion, and it just occurred to me that like people are interacting with evidence differently than you would if this were a scientific study. They are kind of taking things on faith and just approaching the subject differently. And I don't know if anyone has fully established kind of causality there, but UFO belief tends to rise both when things are not so great in the world, and also when there is more kind of secularism and less general spirituality or religiosity, because it is like it's an idea that there's something more going on, there's something more powerful out there, the universe is more special than you thought it was, and all of those feelings are kind of pseudo-religious feelings. So, and can I piggyback also on what Nadia said about interacting with sources? I think you put it great. And my personal way of talking to people who may have those very different beliefs than I do is to say, here's where I'm coming from. Like, I'm a science journalist. I don't necessarily think the same things you do. And this is going to be a process where I'm a journalist and we're talking, and it's not always going to be super pleasant, or like it's going to be long. I'm going to ask you hard questions. We're not always going to agree, and my loyalty is ultimately to the people reading my story and not to you. If you're okay with all of that, I promise to portray what you tell me like accurately and with nuance. And I learned that from doing it wrong first. So it's my hard-won wisdom.
I would love to dig in a little bit more about how some of those interviews have gone, and like, approaching something with curiosity and an open mind is, easier said than done sometimes, right? So can you maybe give an example of a conversation you had, and like when maybe your own beliefs were quite challenged, and how you kind of kept the conversation going and like treated this person with like the respect that they deserved? I spent some time at a strange tourist attraction in Colorado called the UFO Watchtower, which if you all are ever out in southern Colorado, then you should check it out. There was a woman who worked there and had kind of like found her calling there. Like, she'd had a really hard life before. She'd had issues with addiction. She had been unhoused, and then she had found the UFO Watchtower and kind of found her people and her meaning by helping other people go look for UFOs in the Colorado desert. And that's a very meaningful experience for someone to have found a community there. And so I wanted to be very careful with that. And so I told her, I'm coming at this from a skeptical perspective. I haven't seen a UFO. I don't really think there are aliens visiting Earth. But if you tell me what has happened to you, I can tell that to other people. And so, she told me about some sightings that she had and people she had interacted with. And I think just by being open about where I was coming from, she was able to be open. And then I just wrote her stories where people reading my book would already have known, like, oh, Sarah doesn't think that, there was a secret military spaceship that flew into the side of a mountain, which was something she'd seen. But I believe that, I genuinely believe that, like,
that was her experience of what she saw, and I think that that's important, having people believe that you believe their experience, even if you don't interpret it the same way.
You know, we're talking right now about the believer side of things, but also I feel like there's like just as much, perhaps, fervor on like the skeptic side, and sometimes a lot of anger, in fact, when you know, anyone sort of presents a belief in UFOs or UAPs that doesn't sort of like align sort of perfectly with this prevailing ideas, scientific ideas. And I'm curious why we sort of were at a place, at least in 2017, when like the idea of this was like just so easy to dismiss out of hand. Like why in the scientific community and even in the science journalism community, did it become kind of such a joke rather than something that was like an interesting question? I mean, science journalists and scientists are all about curiosity. How did we get there?
I think there's a lot in that question. I would disagree a little bit with the fact that it didn't, like science journalists didn't take it seriously. I think a lot of us did. We were looking into it thinking that's kind of a departure from what we were expecting, this UAP program. And I think what the issue partially is, from our perspective, and I'm not fully answering the question you asked.
It's okay. You're allowed.
Is that when it comes to UAP, there are really two different questions that you have to ask. And one is, are there really unidentified things in the sky? And the second is, if so, what are they? And so the first question we can answer, we can say, yes, there are things in our airspace that we have not expected to see, some of which we cannot immediately identify. And then the second question, what are they, is where the scientific process comes in. And that's what I think is really interesting, because aliens there to me are not really the story. Aliens are in the mix because we haven't been able to rule them out, because that's how science works. But the questions there in terms of science, I think, are actually a lot more interesting.
Right. Well, this is in part why NASA started the independent study that you were part of, right? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of the aims of the study were?
Yeah. So I was part of the independent study team on UAP, Anomalous. And our goal was to answer 8 statements of task that NASA had written, which ultimately served as a model for putting together a roadmap that the agency could follow if it chose to address the question of UAP scientifically. And so these were questions like, what kinds of data do NASA and private enterprises have in hand that could be useful to analyze? What kinds of data can NASA gather? Same with private companies, NGOs. What sorts of machine learning algorithms or AI could we develop to sift through data? Are there different reporting structures that could be put in place for commercial pilots? So thinking mostly about the FAA, because remember, NASA is a civil space agency. So really keeping this in the civilian sector. And so as we went through those statements of task, we put together some ideas, again, just a roadmap that the agency could follow. And that ended up being a really big disappointment for a lot of people who thought that when the study was announced, we would be retroactively looking through decades and decades of reports and coming up with some verdict about whether aliens are a possibility. And so, you know, a lot of the headlines in the stories that came out when the study was announced back in June of 2022 were talking about NASA's alien hunting team. And that's not what it was at all. And so I think that was like a super disappointment for a lot of people who were expecting some really explosive, sensationalized, you know, NASA says UFOs are totally alien type of disclosure, which is not the point.
Sorry, were you gonna?
Oh, I was just gonna make a bad joke, but I can keep it to myself. It was very dumb. I was just gonna say, that's not what I heard. I heard you were on the NASA's alien hunting. It wasn't good. It was for 3rd grade.
We should have had some wine before this, and then I would tell you the truth.
Can I ask something about NASA's study program? So in the I know you weren't part of the initial like press release and stuff because I don't think they had chosen the members yet. But I think when they announced it, there was this whole release like, this is what we're gonna do, this is why we're doing it. By the way, UFOs don't necessarily have anything to do with aliens. However, here's our astrobiology research program, and I feel like that I know you didn't do it, like reinforces the association between UFOs and aliens, even if you're saying like it's not aliens probably, however here's how we do look for them. Like, why do you have any insight into why the agency chose to play it that way?
Okay. I don't have insight into that original play, which I also thought was odd. It was peculiar, because again they were saying like, this is disconnected, but here is the actual work that's going on. I tend to think that, and you had already talked about this a little bit with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, looking for signs of alien technology that are very far away. UFOs, UAP, they live on that same continuum. So I can see that there is a connection there. There is an intellectual connection between thinking that you can find signs of alien technology that are very far away and thinking that you might be looking for them closer to Earth, but the closer you get to Earth, whether it's even within the solar system or within our atmosphere, you start getting eye rolls. And it's because the laws of physics are not in our favor here. But if you think about the probabilities that exist in the cosmos writ large, then it becomes a lot more sensible to be looking for signs of aliens farther away. So that's one thing that I think might have sort of been in the mix. But the other, and I can talk about this for a very long time, so definitely interrupt me, is that we as a committee really thought that using UAP as an example of how the scientific process works could be very powerful. And so if we say, here's how we are doing the actual science of looking for signs of life beyond Earth, whether that's within the solar system, microbes, or in exoplanetary atmospheres, or signs of alien technology, here's how we actually step through that process. We're going to take that and apply it to this other question, and then maybe we can actually do some educating, showing people how critical thinking works. Maybe.
I also was wondering, and this is like totally just a hypothesis I had, but just that like after at least perceived years of like obfuscation or whatever, there was maybe an intentional reason for kind of positioning it that way, to be like, well, we're not admitting to, or we're not saying that this is actually about extraterrestrials, but also we're going to be obvious, like, and open about the fact that we're not like trying to rule this out like out of hand. Do you know what I mean? Which I don't know if that was a good idea or a bad idea. It was probably not a good idea, but yeah.
I think so. The agency is really committed to transparency, which
Right.
is a funny statement to make, because if you watched the press briefing about the report, there was kind of a stumble there as well. So I think that's one part of it. And then the other is, Thomas Terbuchen, who had convened the panel, he gave a talk at NASW about, or like a 5-minute talk about why he did this and some of the motivations behind it. And he was like, do you think I just got out of bed one morning and decided that I'm going to put together this team? And the answer is no, because there's like all kinds of other pressures that come into it as well. And so one of the things that ended up being important was the idea that, high risk, high reward science is valuable.
I would love to talk a little bit about the specifics of like, what data are we talking about when NASA puts together this study and they're like, okay, how do we study this data better? What is the data that we're actually talking about?
Yeah, so NASA, most people think of the agency as looking up at space all the time, but actually it's also a very powerful Earth observing agency. So there are a ton of satellites that are staring at our planet all the time. And so people are really curious about what sorts of data have those satellites gathered that might be informative. Can you sift through them if you can pinpoint maybe even an historical record, a UAP event? Are there data sets that have eyes on that particular location at the right time? And if so, is there something interesting that you can do there? And so one of the questions that you might imagine we were asking as a panel is, well, there was this very large Chinese balloon that happened to float very slowly over the United States this summer. Is that something that NASA's assets could see? What kind of resolution do they have? Because a lot of, the sightings, the UAP sightings, are not large, slow-moving objects. So if those satellites can't pick that up, then what can they see? So that's one example. And then the same as well with commercial companies. They have a lot of satellites that are also just staring at the planet all the time in very high resolution with high cadence sampling. So those are the kinds of data sets that we could think about mining.
Great. Cool. A question that so many science journalists have asked me over the past week, since I have been telling people that I was going to be moderating this panel, is why is so much of the video of that's been published in these articles, why is it so bad?
Well, the aliens intentionally degrade the quality of the videos so that you can't find them, obviously.
I felt like that was implied in some of these questions.
No, I mean, it is kind of a thing that no one could quite figure out, why as cameras get better and more people have them, UFO footage is like a cross correlation going the opposite direction. And I mean, were they talking about the military videos also?
Exactly, the military videos.
I mean, some of it looks bad because it's not actually a camera like the camera that we use.
Mm-hmm.
It's infrared, which is not it doesn't quite make sense to our eyes, and it's less resolved than other cameras. But I think also it probably has something to do with there's a guy named Mick West who, if you've been on the UFO internet at all, you've probably heard of. He is kind of a video analyst, and he looks at UFO reports and UFO videos to try to explain them and turn all of the UFOs that he can into identified flying objects. And the ones that kind of remain UFOs are in what he calls the low information zone, which just means there's not, it is a bad video. You can't figure out what it is because it wasn't great to start with, and you don't have enough information to do that. And despite that, I think that he has also mostly figured out what is going on in those videos.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think in the Department of Defense report from 2021, they had 144, I think, UFOs, and they could only identify one of them, not because the others were crazy, amazing spaceships, but because they didn't have enough data to even know where to start to figure out what they were.
Right. I'm curious, what it would take. I mean, I'm not even talking about extraterrestrials here, but what it would take for technology. How much better does the technology need to be to, be able to solve some of these mysteries, even if the solution is extremely pedestrian? And is the government, from either of your reporting, are they actually going to make attempts to update military jets so that when they see something anomalous, it's oh, actually that was a seagull moving really weirdly? Whatever, I don't know. We're a drone.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the full answers to those questions, but I know, you mentioned the Chinese balloon, and I know that the people in the Department of Defense who are tasked with tracking things that are in the airspace above the U.S., after that happened, I think they changed the algorithm that they used to look for things that were more slow-moving and not just fast things. And then they started seeing all kinds of UFOs because there were a lot of things. And so I think, now I'm forgetting how this answers the question or not, but there are efforts there at least, and you can maybe speak to the scientific side more, but within the Department of Defense to do more calibration of the sensors and things to gather more data to try to figure out what does this population of things we can't immediately identify look like. And then also there's some development in the private sector being sold to the government to take profiles of aircraft and drones and get those profiles from all angles, at all altitudes, at all speeds, and see, so that you can match, like, I saw this weird thing, is it a weird thing we know about? And so to just kind of sort the wheat from the chaff, I guess.
Right.
But
Dan?
I thought I would try to spur questions by asking the first one. I forgot to say earlier, but especially today, let's make them questions and not speeches or testimonies. Now I have a speech.
tell us your UFO story.
Yeah. Started? I can't talk about it. It's painful. I feel like in my career as a journalist that whenever I've covered something for which there isn't good evidence, the act of covering is not really too difficult. We know how to apply evidence and figure out what we should say and why. It's not that difficult. We just follow the rules of good evidence-based journalism. The really hard part is figuring out not how to cover, but whether to cover. And so I wonder if you guys would be willing to talk about that for a while. How do we know, or do we know, whether shining a light on what we actually know, what we can actually confidently say about these incidents, are we serving the public by doing that, or is the very act of covering it, are we somehow contributing to pseudoscience by doing so? I think it's a really difficult problem, and I wonder how, in your own work, how you think about this problem.
One of the reasons I agreed to be on the NASA panel was partially so I could just DQ myself from covering UAP ever again because of a conflict of interest. I'm not sure that answers I know it doesn't answer your question. I think it actually is important to cover things like this when they are in the public eye, with something as visible as the New York Times story and whatever was happening in the Pentagon at that point. Obviously, there actually is a program in the Pentagon now that exists, and I think that's worth talking about, because if we can do that responsibly, as we do as science journalists, then it's helping to remind people that there are actually standards of evidence that matter, and that it's important to think about the information that you're getting, where it's coming from, how accurate it is, what the motivations are behind it. So that's my take, but I wouldn't go out of my way to cover something like UAP or like pick your favorite paranormal thing unless it was really in the spotlight. I don't know. How do you feel?
I don't know. I mean, that's part of the reason that I haven't, I did write a book about UFOs, but I haven't written very many articles about it since. And in that reporting, I was trying to take on, UFOs have been around in culture for, around 75 or 80 years. They interact with money and war and politics and religion and all this stuff, and I tried to take it from that angle. If they're this kind of persistent human phenomenon, what does that mean about us? How does it interact with us? And so that's kind of how I thought about it, not weighing in on the science of whether they were real or what they represented or not exactly. And then I agree with Nadia, if these are government programs, that's typical journalism fodder. That's taxpayer money. Is it being well spent? Is it an evidence-based program? And I think those questions are all worth asking. And where I've drawn my personal line, I think, is not writing an article just because it's sensational and popular. Hey, there's a new UFO video. Do you want to write about it? And I say no, thank you. I don't want to do that at all. But is there actual news? Is there something new? Is there something that's worthwhile for people to know about? At least that's what I try to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think personally for me, through some of the reporting that's popped up since 2017, one of the most interesting things is just how much of the money how much government money is going to like people who are kind of just hacks. And like that seems like a revelation. Like that seems like a big deal, right? Where it's like proven that these people over and over again are like spouting misinformation, and like that seems like absolutely something worth reporting on, for sure.
I agree. I think, so one of the things that I would love somebody to do, if you have enough time to do like a dissertation or write a book.
Just in your spare
Just
time.
in your spare time. But I really want to know the answer. What is the return on investment for politicians who continue to say that the government is hiding evidence of aliens? Because if you listen to the hearings, the statements that often accompany the opening remarks are kind of mind-boggling. And so I'm very curious, like, what is the economic relationship between continuing to promote that belief and the money that you get as a politician? Because I'm sure there's a relationship there somewhere. There has to be.
Yeah.
So what goes into that black box? What comes out?
Well, it certainly keeps you in the spotlight. I mean, yeah, there's going to be a few days of cameras pointed at you at least.
Yeah, but then like the very beginning of it with Harry Reid and Bigelow and
Yeah.
there's so much money that's like trading hands there. It's very interesting to me.
Bigelow is basically, he like had this ranch in Nevada, Skinwalker Ranch.
Oh yeah, sorry, Utah.
Oh, Utah, sorry.
Yeah,
Maybe
Utah.
you guys
Yeah.
should talk about
No,
this.
no,
And I,
you're good, you're
yeah.
Somebody over there said Utah.
Thank you.
I was like,
I
yeah,
have a
that's right.
microphone, so.
Same state.
Yeah, maybe somebody else should fill in since you're the people who've actually studied this more than me.
Yeah, Bigelow had a ranch in Utah, and it had been owned by people who said that it was basically like haunted by strange paranormal things, and then he bought it to do an investigation of these strange paranormal things and started the National Institute for Discovery Science to try to study them, and those things included UFOs, and then it was his company that got the contract for the Pentagon's program.
He also has an aerospace company that's making, or they were making, inflatable habitats, modules for the International Space Station. We call them bouncy houses in space. They're not actually bouncy houses, but they kind of look like it.
Yeah. There has been somebody waiting very patiently.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. You can take it off. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Guy Young. I'm a current SHRP student. I don't have any alien stories, but I do have a question that's kind of related to the question that Dan just asked. So I'm from South Korea, and in my country, it's really common for the media to break like mystical news, like UFOs or celebrities doing drugs, like exactly when one politicians want to cover up something that they don't want the public to keep talking about. And you guys also kind of mentioned how there's always like some incentive sometimes by the way and the timing that things are broken about UFOs, like where they suddenly start talking about it. So I guess like I was just wondering, you know, in your reporting, have you guys sort of like experienced cases where, well, the timing is kind of strange, or maybe like it's not, I mean, because as science journalists, we have to talk about the scientific truth, but like rather than it being sort of being like driven by sort of the pursuit for scientific discovery, it's more like, talk about this instead, like don't look at me, something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know when the initial 2017 story came out, it just so happened to coincide with the launch of a private company called To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science that was having a crowdfunding campaign to try to reverse engineer UFOs, and all of the people associated with that company were part of the New York Times story, which I'm sure is just a coincidence. And then, you know, there was another New York Times story about UFO sightings that came out, like I think either the same week as a television show with all the same people who were in the story. And so in this case, I think it was more aligned with like PR incentives necessarily than political things. But I do think that, you know, from the defense side right now, you know, leaders are concerned with, you know, drones being where they shouldn't be, or, you know, other countries' technology being where we don't know that it is, and being very sneaky and getting, you know, Congress to appoint funds to study UFOs is also getting them to appoint money to study, these actual
Right.
drones from other countries, and so it kind of serves double duty, I guess.
So Sean Kirkpatrick, who ran the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, which is the office within the DoD that's compiling all the UAP reports, he has said in a couple of interviews that he tells folks, to Sarah's point, you better hope I find evidence for aliens, because if I don't, that means people are doing stuff in our backyard.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, there is good reason to look into this that has nothing to do with aliens. For sure.
For sure, and that's why I thought when NASA started doing the study, it was interesting to me that a civilian space agency was kind of taking up the science cause.
Yeah, for sure. Is this a line of questions? Okay, cool. Yeah.
Hey there. It's weird kind of being behind you, but hi there. In terms of the issue of whether and how you should cover something, I've been trying to figure this out. Is that just whether this is even like a possibility of physics? I mean, if you could travel at the speed of light, which you can't, there are no stars nearby that appear to have any life, so you'd be traveling hundreds, thousands, millions of years to get here. And is it just like an ipso facto, there are no aliens? Like,
That's you.
Like at all?
well, not that could come to Earth.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, I think the laws of physics, again, are not really in our favor there. But to say that's totally impossible, I wouldn't go there. I don't think you can really prove a negative like that. Getting an assist from the audience. I'm going to let Sarah take that one.
I mean, I think one time I was writing an article that was kind of about the continuum Nadia was talking about earlier between the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and UFOs, and one is searching for aliens out there and one is looking for them in the here, and I was trying to make the point that they are on a spectrum, and an editor said, well, they're not exactly the same because we don't have a theoretical we have a theoretical framework for how aliens on some other planet could build a radio broadcaster and send radio waves our way. We ourselves don't have a theoretical framework for building a spaceship that is helped by special relativity to come here in a reasonable amount of time for its inhabitants. That doesn't mean that one doesn't exist somewhere else, that someone else hasn't discovered it, that we won't in the future, but we don't have a way that we know that could work. So, TLDR, don't know. I don't know.
Hi, my name is Noah Augustine. I'm a 16-year-old journalist, and I'd just like to ask how the public opinion about UFOs has changed from when they first became popular knowledge in the 20th century, I assume, to today. Thank you.
Great question.
That is a great question. Well, I think, the idea of the existence of UFOs, a lot of people trace back to like the mid-1940s with kind of the Roswell era of things. And interestingly, back then, and if anyone is interested, there's a historian named Greg Agigian from, I'm going to forget if it's Penn State or the University of Pennsylvania, but one of those. And he makes the point that back then, in those first, people were like, oh, there's flying discs out there, they're very strange. People didn't associate them with aliens right away. Like at the beginning, that association wasn't there at all, and it kind of grew over the years. So I would say that's the first thing. And then I think that, interest in them and how people perceive their seriousness has kind of waxed and waned over the years, and I think we're in a period of people taking them more seriously than they have in the past. But I don't know that there's been like a straight evolution over time, more kind of up and down, and that we're kind of on the upswing, particularly because of our people giving them lots of coverage in the mainstream publications.
Can I ask you a question?
No.
Oh.
Yeah, what's up?
Question-free zone.
I wanted to hear more about what you said like right at the beginning about how interest in UFOs and sightings tends to spike when things are not great. And so, like, what are some of the events historically and perhaps recently that you think have been driving some of the uptick in interest here? Because that seemed like a really, really interesting connection to me that I hadn't really explored.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning in the 40s, you know, we had just invented nuclear weapons and we were getting around to, you know, rockets and missiles and things like that, and everyone was very concerned with what was in the sky, because if there was something in the sky, like maybe you were getting bombed in a very deadly way. And so it became a place of like fear and curiosity, I think, and you know, I didn't come up with that. Historians have written about UFOs that way. And I think, like, and this is my subjective interpretation, but like things have been similar the past few years. Like there's been a lot of global tension, and now more actual like large scale conflict than there has been in the past. And I think that when I guess this is maybe a little woo-woo, but like when that kind of thing is in the air, people still have that kind of like paranoia and interest in what is up there that they had back when like nuclear weapons were new.
Just to build on the last question too, you know, we've seen these cycles of UFO interest and like a flurry of coverage, and I'm curious, like, where are we right now in that cycle? If you could compare it to like past times, there's been like a ton of interest.
I think the wave may have crested. I think that like the interest started to rise around 2017 with that article. Now we've had, you know, an official political response. We have study teams in the scientific community and the military community, and I think usually what happens historically is like there's public interest, official programs form to either like confirm what's going on or debunk what's going on, and that like satisfies the people who lose interest once those things happen. And so I think we're kind of on the backside of what is happening. And historically, you know, the military forms programs to study UFOs and then determines like, we don't know what to do with this. This is not actually a national security threat, and we're going to shut this program down. And I don't know if that's what will happen this time, but yeah, we'll see.
Sorry. Yeah, go for it. Sorry, you've been waiting for a while.
I'm curious how you find trustworthy sources for a topic like this, because just because somebody has a PhD or is affiliated with an Ivy League university doesn't necessarily mean, you know, in these stories, I always expect to see Avi Loeb's name. So, which isn't to say he shouldn't be spoken to, but how do you approach this with sensitivity and skepticism?
It's a good question. I was going to make a crack about Harvard astronomer, but you already did it, so I'm not going there. Yeah, I approach finding sources in this arena in exactly the same way that I do in general, which is to just vet everybody as best I can. I think in some cases it's pretty obvious that there might be some personal motivations at play that I would try to avoid. So, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's helped me to get perspective from not from the people in addition to the people actually making the claims, like a certain Harvard astronomer, but from people who kind of study it from the outside. Like there are historians who study UFOs and anthropologists who study UFO belief and religious scholars who study, you know, similar things, and kind of getting their perspective on the whole situation, and also maybe on what a source with a story about UFOs told me, I found to be very perspective giving.
I think some of the most interesting science questions we can ask around the UAP phenomena are not about aliens. it's a lot of what Sarah has been talking about. You know, when do we see spikes in sightings? How do they correspond with world affairs? You know, I'm really curious about the geographical distribution, the psychology. Why do we think that we see things in the sky? Like, what psychologically is going on there? We haven't even talked about eyewitness credibility and all of the issues that are involved there as well, and the fact that humans are fallible and sensors are fallible. And so, you know, it really is a phenomenon that is so much broader than just thinking that we might be finding signs of extraterrestrial technology in our atmosphere. And so finding those people too who are approaching it from angles that are broader, I think is a really great way to contextualize it. And that, for journalists, is what I think is really important too, is to remember that this is a phenomenon that lives in a much bigger context than just, is it ET or not?
Right, exactly.
That's actually a really great segue to an online question. It's from Megan Bartels, who's a SHRP grad and editor at Scientific American and was formerly at space.com. And she asks, has this reporting changed the way that you approach other stories? And if so, how? Nadia already sort of gave us a hint into that, but Nadia, you edit a lot of stories on topics other than unidentified objects. And Sarah, you cover all kinds of things. You just had a story this week about Mars colonization, and you know, what would we do about food supply with or without insects? So what Megan seems to be asking is, what have you learned from wrestling with this particular topic that is applicable in a broader sense to your work as journalists?
I think that, I mean, to me, if I learned that it was important to think about UFOs in their like political, spiritual, monetary, whatever context, like, and they are, you know, kind of a pseudoscientific topic a lot of the time, it is only even more important to do so with some of the more straightforwardly scientific topics that we do. Like, they're also not divorced from things like federal funding and the ups and downs of administrations and people's own beliefs in the public about them. And so to kind of think about them all in that like whole world context as much as possible, I think it's a good reminder to do that. Do you want to talk about
What Sarah said.
Okay. Nadia, I'm actually really curious, as a journalist being asked to be part of this NASA panel itself, I'm wondering kind of what considerations you made just deciding to even join the panel.
Yeah. It was not an easy yes. I had to really think about it, both from a personal perspective, because I was aware that kind of jumping into this arena more publicly can bring you a lot of negative attention. So did I want to invite that into my life? And then professionally, you know, the biggest question was, how can I do this without finding myself in a major conflict of interest when it comes to covering astronomy, astrophysics, like anything NASA does? What does it mean to, Dan Bergano at NASW said, how dare you go work for the man? How did you justify that? So I tried to preserve as much independence as I could between you know, myself and NASA, as well as the publications that I worked for at the time. And so the first thing I did was I declined the honorarium that the agency offered. So I did work for them for free. So there was no financial transaction there. And then I had actually run the question all the way up to various editors at the publications I was working for, just to make sure that they didn't have any issues with it. And then the last thing we did was we said that I was going to be identified just as a science journalist, totally independent of any publication that I might be working for, to preserve the publication's independence so that they could cover the study if they wanted to. So those were some of the things.
Did any editors push back at all? Interesting.
And yeah, it's like, would you have?
What a good question. I don't want to give a quick answer to that. I think I'd need to think about it a little bit more. But I mean, I think I would have, in your shoes, joined the panel.
Yeah, I mean, it was something I will say that nobody gave me a quick answer.
Yeah.
So, also probably because that's not the kind of question your reporter comes to you with every day.
Exactly.
So, interesting things to think about. But yeah, ultimately I was very curious about how these kinds of reports are put together.
That's what I was going to say. Like, as from a journalistic perspective, it's actually just like a fascinating kind of reporting opportunity, right? Like, you're really seeing the inner workings of, like, you know, what's going on in there. How does this happen?
What is going on in there?
Yeah, what's going on in there?
Someone should have given me a glass of wine for that. I will not say. No, it's actually kind of everything you would expect.
Yep.
So when we were putting together the report, we had some fact-finding meetings where we had people giving us presentations about various issues that we were considering, so different sensors, different data sets, different projects, and just really taking all of that information and then as a committee coming up with ideas and recommendations for what the agency could do. Nothing super secret. We did not get a tour of the bunkers where the bodies are buried.
I have a really technical question, but do you have Yeah, go for it.
Hi, my name is Keith Flore. I teach journalism here. I wanted to ask the panelists how much you thought this topic has been a product of the media. Because historically, when you look at some of the scholarship, and I've looked into it a little bit, there is some journalism scholars who have gone back and looked at the archives and noticed that so much of the journalism in the 50s, late 40s, and early and all through the 50s was really, really poor, really very, very single-sourced, very sensationalistic, that sort of fueled the phenomenon. And I think that there's been some evidence that that's happened, you know, pretty much since then. As Sarah said, you know, we've gone in these up and down cycles, and if we look at what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years since the Time stories, that seems to have played out again, where it's sort of just the media has made it into the story. So I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that the fact that UFOs have been in, you know, the most revered publications and, you know, television networks, 60 Minutes, the New York Times, those names lend credibility to the reporting in a way that maybe is different from the past. Like, I think one of the communication studies that I read was like in the past, you know, there would be some poorly reported story in a local newspaper about some guy who saw a UFO, and it wouldn't get picked up until it did, and then it would become national news, and everyone would have a poorly sourced story about it, and that would go viral in the way of, you know, the 50s or 60s virality. And I think that this is a little different from that, and then it started from the top. But I think that having that credibility, like, for years after the New York Times story came out, I would see people tweeting or Xing or whatever we are doing, like, I can't believe the New York Times said there's aliens on Earth and we just moved on with our lives. And just like, you know, the New York Times said that the UFOs are here, and we all just kept going. And I think like that name makes a difference, and 60 Minutes makes a difference, and spreads it farther than it would otherwise. And yeah.
Yeah, I think some of the reporting this summer, I mean, I'm the moderator, I'm not supposed to be. But no, I think some of the reporting this summer, left a lot of people very confused at best. about exactly why there were these hearings. I think like the hearings themselves kind of lent some legitimacy to what was being said. And I'm actually curious for your take on that, because there's sort of just to build on that last question, there's this like kind of cycle where it's like the media reports on it, there's public interest, and then politicians like end up giving a much bigger platform as well to people who at best may just like be a single source who is confused, or I don't know. I don't want to speak ill of anyone, but yeah.
I think you're right, and I was going to say that I think this summer Congress did a pretty good job being their own circus, that we as journalists we should be reporting on that for all the reasons that we talked about before, that, this is taxpayer money, these are elected officials. That should be something that we are allowed to scrutinize. But I also agree that in a very real sense, a lot of the UAP machine is kind of a self-feeding media monster, for lack of a better term.
And I think, not to deflect blame off of people like us, but I think that editors have a lot to do with that. Like your editor coming to you after the initial story came out saying like, will you write about this? And like I have other friends who work at other who work at space-centric publications who like, oh no, there was another UFO thing, I'm gonna have to write about it, like whether it's worthy or not, because people will read that story. And I think that's, there are real pressures to publish stories that people will read, but I think that the people in charge of us could do a slightly better job determining which of those things is worth covering and which is not. Because when everybody starts to cover it, then more people start to cover it, and that's just how it works.
Right. I also think that like even if an article is so well written and so well sourced, then if the headline is bad, if the headline is sensational, like that just that's what's going out to people. That's what you see on X, Twitter. That's what you see there, or what like comes out in an Apple News, alert. Even just today, I was kind of like pulling some of the reporting from the summer, and I realized that a number of headlines just got cut off because of like word count, and so all I got was like congressional hearings, like or like someone in a congressional hearing says that there were non-human like organic matter ... and like then like the context just kind of like got completely cut out of the headline. It was just exceedingly frustrating. I have like a very technical question for you, Sarah, that will probably only appeal to the journalists in the room, but I'm going to ask because we're in a journalism school. You've done a lot of FOIAing in the past for your work surrounding UFOs, and you've also interviewed people who have done a lot of FOIAing around this. And I'm curious how you put information that you get from the government like that into a context that makes sense, and like how you're kind of like then vetting what you find.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so one of the people who I've interviewed who's done many, many more FOIA requests than me, his name is John Greenwald, and he runs a website called The Black Vault, an ominous name for a site that just has like a lot of government documents. I think he has millions of pages and thousands of FOIA requests. And I asked him this question, like, he's very into UFOs, and he is of the viewpoint that, the government has covered up UFO things in the past, which is true, and has lied about things. And I'm like, well, if that's the case, like, what is the value of these documents to you if you think that the government will lie to you? And he said that the government may lie, but the documents don't lie about themselves. If that's what they're working with in the office, or that's the public story that they're telling, then that is useful information to have too, even if it's not the real story. And I don't fully know how, I don't know how to get all of the government's secrets that they are not willing to tell me. I definitely wish that I did. I wish. If anyone here figures it out, please tell me. But I think that questioning questioning it in the first place, and then also to me it's been useful to question the motivation of like, why was this released? to me. Like, if it wasn't something that they legally had to release, like, why did they do it? What's their motivation? And those kinds of typical questions that you would ask of any source or document.
Great. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to invite any final questions up to the mic. But I have a question that a few friends asked me earlier today. And this is maybe not something that you necessarily have like reported on, but I'm curious, at least from your personal opinion, what is the downside to the government kind of looking into UAPs? Is there a downside to it? Or is it really just like something that is worth doing for national security, even if it has nothing to do with extraterrestrial life?
I think it's worth doing. I think that some of the associations that come along with that aren't always, great or ideal even for their study, but like it is the job of the Department of Defense to defend and to like know what's going on up there. And so I think like from that national security perspective, I would be concerned if they were not concerned, if they didn't want to find out that kind of information. And I think knowing what's up there, knowing if there truly is something unidentified, like being able to like say, this is the population of objects up there, these we can classify, these we cannot. I think that's useful. And I think, I'm sure Nadia can speak more to this, but from the scientific perspective, like looking at a bunch of data for anomalies has historically led to a lot of scientific discovery, because those anomalies are where the things we haven't found yet are. And like, maybe that's aliens, but maybe not, and maybe it's something else interesting, and I think that's useful too.
Yeah, I would echo everything Sarah just said, and to build on the science case a little bit more, because that was something that we were considering on the NASA panel, is there enough of a science motivation here for the agency to invest in looking at UAP? And that's a question that NASA gets to answer. But it is true that every time you have studied something that you don't understand, you tend to learn something new. And that can almost certainly be the case here, whether it's that we're more closely scrutinizing our own planet with Earth observing assets that we already have, or we're building instruments that are looking at the sky in a different way, or we're asking people to gather data on their phones. There is going to be something new in there. It's just, what is it? And so you look at the history of astronomical observations and things you didn't expect, and you get things like gamma ray bursts and fast radio bursts and things that initially looked very weird, but ultimately are teaching us something really that we didn't know about the universe before. So.
Wait, is one of your recommendations to have people collect data on their phones?
That is in there. It's an idea that we had for like a crowdsourcing app.
Yeah.
That people, despite the inverse correlation between improving cell phones and the quality of the images that you tend to see, again, not blaming anybody, but yes, we do have technologies literally in our pockets now that if we could put them together could potentially be useful, because every image you take contains metadata.
I mean, I remember a long time ago, this has nothing to do with UFOs, but like, wasn't there a crowdsourcing project that took people's photos of the night sky and like helped identify a comet? Or was it a comet? Or does anyone else remember this? Am I spreading misinformation here? Yeah, but like specifically using like machine learning to like take a bunch of images and like identify. Anyway, sorry, I'm forgetting now. Yeah, yeah, it sounds cool. Sounds cool if true. Don't quote me. Yeah.
So can I push back ever so gently on, or just present a counter, because I do think there is a downside. Not to the government studying this, but the way it studies it and the way that the topic is framed. Because we live in, as we all know, a frothy conspiracy era. And this is a topic that has been historically, culturally tied up with, really, it's one of the original modern day conspiracy narratives, right up there with the Kennedy assassination. And so much of the discussion takes place in that conspiracy sphere. And I think if we looked at how the government has discussed this, the Pentagon, because we live in that low information zone with this topic, they don't reveal a lot. and it just fuels conspiracies. And look at the congressional hearing, look at the way they talk about it. It's all about this massive cover-up. So I do think there is a downside. It's not, but I just think it's the way the topic has been framed and even approached, not by NASA, certainly not by NASA. I think what was done there was terrific, but I don't think the Pentagon has handled it responsibly.
Do you guys agree?
I really like the term frothy conspiracy narrative. It's like, yes. I know, I think that's a very valid point. Sarah?
Yeah, I also think it's a totally valid point, and I think it probably has a lot to do with the origins of the defense program. As you well know, like that was fomented by people who had ulterior motives, including a private company, and it all kind of comes from this place in this small circle of people who have their own agenda, and so that kind of taints everything. But yeah, I agree with you.
Can I make one side point?
Sure.
Just in terms of our own edification as consumers of information, speaking to the conspiracy, the cover-up, so often we hear, well, all the data are classified, everything's classified, they're keeping all the good stuff. If only we could see what's in the classified information, then we would have the truth. And I think it's really important to know why a lot of things are classified. And it's not because of what's actually in the image, but it's because of the censor that took the image. So on the NASA team, we were working completely with unclassified data. That was it, so that we could everybody could see it. We could be really transparent about it. And the example that we used was, if you took an image of the Statue of Liberty using a sensor that was classified, that image would be classified, just because of what it can tell you about the sensor's capabilities, not because of any information in the image. So people have this idea that there are all kinds of, they're not releasing the classified images because of what they show, but really it's just because of the sensors, usually.
Right, and when it has to do with UFOs, people think it's like interesting and there must be something very cool behind it. But like that's also true of every boring picture, a spy satellite has ever taken. We just don't think or care about those because they're boring. And then all of a sudden when it's UFOs, like, oh, it's classified because it's amazing information about the universe. And it's like, no, it's classified for the same reason as everything else.
Right. But also, those sensors sound real cool. Like, I kind of just want to know about the sensors.
The sensors they sound
They know
really
about
cool.
you.
Yeah. Oh, no. All right, we are actually over time, but I have one final, just fun question for each of you. Do you have a favorite UFO story? It can be something that's been completely debunked, but I'm just curious what your sort of favorite tale is from all of the reporting work you've done in this area.
I mean, I really do actually like the one I was talking about earlier from the woman who worked at the UFO watchtower. She told me she was sitting on her porch talking to her mom on the phone, and she saw a giant black spaceship go into the side of the mountain, and I was like, I would love to see that. That sounds amazing. And so, I don't know, it's the small personal ones that get to me, not the big famous ones, and I think that has to do with like the personal meeting that someone else has with it, and also that like she had no reason to lie to me about it. Like she definitely saw something, and it was definitely strange. She's not a government official, she doesn't have a private company, she just saw something weird and had feelings about it, and I think that is interesting.
Right, I know, it just sort of brings up like anyone could see something that they don't understand and be like deeply moved by it, and that's actually kind of an amazing thing. Yeah.
I have a couple, but I'll go with one. I was on a plane a couple years ago, and next to me there was a pilot who was deadheading. And I ask a lot of questions when I'm sitting next to pilots, because I just really want to know what it's like up there in the cockpit, because it just seems like it's so much fun. And so I was asking her, what kinds of things do you see that you don't understand? And she said that one of the things that pilots regularly trip on is the planet Venus. And she's
That's
been
so
on a
interesting.
couple of flights where she's seen something on the horizon. It's a bright light, but it's like, it's changing color. It's really bright. You can't get in touch with it. It's not moving as you would expect an aircraft to move, but it's just there. And she says, eventually they always realize that this is a planet, that it's Venus. It's not something in Earth's atmosphere, but it's something that can masquerade as an object that she needs to be watching out for. And I just thought, that is so cool. And it tells you so much about how human brains work.
Yeah. Yeah, really incredible. Venus is a fairly common one to mistake as a UFO, right?
Yeah, and especially if it's like low on the horizon and you've got a lot of haze, then you know the colors are not what you'd expect. And
Really interesting.
Yeah, I just thought that was fun.
That's awesome. Well, Sarah, Nadia, thank you both so much for your time and your insight. This was really wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for speaking with us. Will you two be able to stick around if